here today to give a historical retrospective of electronic information systems. My name is Edward Johnson, aka Eddie, and I'm the president of InfoEd International. I'm here today with Pat Johnson. Pat Johnson was the vice president for sponsored programs of the Research Foundation of the State University of New York. She retired back in 2006 after a 40-year career in electronic research administration. How are you today, Pat?
I'm fine, thank you, Eddie. Nice to be here.
FDP. I know you were a part of that. How long were you involved with that?
Well, the foundation was involved since the beginning. In fact, the director of sponsored programs at the time was one of leading members of the Florida demonstration project, which then later evolved into the federal demonstration project. And he actually worked with Senator Childs, who was one of the originators of that Florida demonstration project. And actually, I think it was one of the real innovations of sponsored programs over the last 30 years. They were able to streamline a lot of the mundane kind of functions, for instance, the extension of a grant. If a faculty member asked for an extension to a project for 6 months, it was automatically granted. So why then did that not become part of the local authorities to be able to extend grants? There were other things, and I think besides the smaller kind of advances in the accountability being returned to the university versus the feds, was that it also afforded the government a whole host of sponsored program administrators that they could tap for information. It became the first
community, if you will?
Well, actually, yes, and it became their little experts. Their confidential informants in some cases, or actually the group of people that they could rely on to call for expert, advice on issues.
I know nowadays, because of the complexity involved, those groups are key because everybody may have a niche, if you will, of how they manage something. So when you're approaching a situation, say, how do you comply with this? How do you handle that? These kinds of groups are probably invaluable then, and even as I know they are today.
And it also afforded the university types access to high-level government officials charged with this grant administration to get their perspective. And I don't think good rules can come out until both sides understand each other, and I think that helped.
Now, there's a piece of trivia. I know that it started at the Florida demonstration project. Why? Why Florida? Why was that?
I actually don't have the answer to that question, other than it was one of the areas where the governor was willing to take a stand. He was willing to support his university officials in trying to get something done which would alleviate some of the burden, and to them, cost.
Okay. So then probably through that initiative, then the rest of the country, if you will, said, rather than states acting out in unison, let's come together in one.
That's correct. Well, the Florida demonstration project proved that there was streamlining that could happen in an environment where accountability wasn't being lost by the federal government.
And then, of course, it also, I'm sure, creates a relationship where the government has a single point to engage as opposed to trying to go out and at least conversate or meet the independent needs of all the universities.
Well, that's right, because, the government is public accountability number one, and they were satisfied that the universities could engage in this kind of flexibility without any risk to public accountability.
Interesting. So then, a little bit farther along, I believe back in the mid to early 2000s, George Bush had mandated a few years prior the idea of a centralized grants database, if you will, which I believe was the birth of Grants.Gov. And I know one of their first charters was initially just to put up funding opportunities and to provide them available in a database. And I'm sure you remember that.
Yes, I do.
Now, how did that affect your doing business, if you will, now having those from one central repository? Did that help, hurt? I imagine it should be an asset.
I don't, by then all of the application processing was done on every campus, and we didn't really do it in the central office at all. But as I recall, it sort of leveled the playing field for most. I mean, it gave the same opportunity to all if you could use the system, and we were, all computer literate, so that was not an issue.
So there were probably opportunities that if faculty were not willing to share because they maybe found that money stream, but now in this environment, it was
It did level, yeah, it did, especially for the smaller campuses.
Right. I want to thank you for taking the time to go over this today. It's been a very interesting trek over your 40 years and how ERA has evolved over it. So thanks again.
You're welcome.